After Nintendo and Bandai Namco entered into a share transfer agreement, Bandai Namco Studios Singapore is now to be Nintendo Studios Singapore. And, well, that's a pretty interesting development following hot on the heels of Shuntaro Furukawa's recent illustration of purchasing studios as one potential use of Nintendo's increasing development capital. With the equivalent of about $750,000 plunged in to secure the studio, Nintendo have already confirmed that it will be a minor impact on Nintendo's balance sheet, but it's still a big step forward for them. So what do we know about this studio, why the sale, and what might the future bring? First of all, we should recognize that this doesn't feel like something that Nintendo have been particularly pressuring for. Nintendo could easily have kept supporting Bandai Namco by giving the studio work, but keeping it at arm's length. But it appears that Bandai Namco may have wanted to divest itself of the studio for reasons of its own. Nintendo has a relatively small stake in Bandai Namco itself, and these companies are obviously very close, so I'm sure this will have been a matter of ongoing discussion between the two companies' leaderships. The process of the purchase seems to be in two stages, with 80% bought out now and 20% later. I've noted before that very often when Nintendo buy a large stake in a company, it's with the intention of ultimately completing the purchase later, and we've seen this with Monolith Soft, Nintendo Cube, and others in recent years. Nevertheless, in this case, it appears to be part of ensuring continuity of business with Bandai Namco's existing projects. The studio has worked in a support capacity for Nintendo titles for many years, and Bandai Namco is a very close partner of Nintendo's anyway. They have a studio, Studio S, explicitly targeting to develop for Nintendo, the Sakurai team, and at least one other studio that routinely makes Nintendo titles, specifically the group behind Pokken Tournament and New Pokemon Snap, with these developers seeming to be from the core studio, Studio One, of Tekken and Soul Calibur fame. It should be noted that many of the new Pokemon Snap developers have not received substantial recent credits, suggesting that there is a further game to come, although there was also reports of a potentially cancelled Bandai Namco game that was a Nintendo commission, so potentially it could have been that. However, the Singapore-based studio also has supported on multiple games in recent times, including, according to the Nintendo Fandom Wiki, pretty much every Bandai Namco-developed first-party title in the last decade, plus Splatoon 3, where Bandai Namco Singapore and Malaysia were credited. However, it's only the Singapore team that are the subjects of this purchase agreement, and this starts to make sense of why, from Bandai Namco's perspective, a sale might have been seen as a positive for them. The company has struggled recently with cancelled projects, and it may be an effective cost-saving measure in any event to focus on just one regional studio in this area. But in any event, Singapore would be a far more expensive city in terms of land costs and salaries, despite what appear to be slightly more favourable tax incentives compared with Malaysia. Singapore obviously still serves as a great talent magnet, and the higher wages will attract top industry talent, but it would be far more expensive to maintain on the current basis for a relatively smaller company like Bandai Namco, although Bandai Namco is also very largely diversified as well. For Nintendo, their greater size makes sustaining a Singapore studio far less of a difficulty, and it fits with their long-term strategy. For Bandai Namco, they can transfer most of their operations to somewhere that at least is in the same region, and they can likely still sustain themselves through trickier times by having Bandai Namco Malaysia offering support work to Nintendo as required, since I anticipate the lines of communication between these studios will remain strong, and I'm sure that Nintendo will continue to need support assistance on their games as they continue to grow. Also, though, and fitting in with the long-term trend of Nintendo's acquisitions, these appear to be very long-time partners of Nintendo, even besides their support work, with rumours being strong that they even worked for a couple of years on the original but discontinued version of Metroid Prime 4. Now, I take rumours with a strong grain of salt, but it certainly only strengthens the evidence of a strong working relationship going back a long time between Nintendo and the Singapore studio, if we take these rumours as true. It strikes me that the establishment of the Singapore branch of Nintendo earlier this year must have been intended as a vital step towards this move. While it's not essential that Nintendo studios are in places with a Nintendo branch, it must make coordination easier. Moreover, having more people with experience of the market within the company can only be of use to them. So, what are Nintendo actually buying? Well, the size of the studio isn't something I've been able to find definitive proof on. Some of their LinkedIn profiles suggest that the size is 50 to 200 and probably on the smaller end of that, as another version suggests under 50. Now, not every studio needs to be massive, but for the kinds of AAA games we're talking about, and especially if they are going to be providing graphical support on titles like the next Splatoon, it's curious what the scope of any future projects could be. They recently released, in collaboration with the Malaysian team and others, an origami-based platform game called Hiragami, a game whose unique style has been compared in the press to Paper Mario. And while it's not on Nintendo systems, you can certainly feel like it's the kind of project that makes sense from a Nintendo-aligned set of developers and suggests that they're closer in spirit to Nintendo, perhaps, than, say, the half of Mercury's team that is not focused on Nintendo projects, which is producing more traditional Western action games. Tom Phillips of Eurogamer said, "Hiragami was born as a staff side project within Bandai Namco's Singapore studio, I'm told, and propelled on from concept demo stage towards a public release thanks to internal enthusiasm for the idea and a desire for it to find a proper audience." End quote. I'd also point out that the team actually has a few Nintendo links, and one of the project managers has a special thanks on Splatoon 3. Because this was a collaborative Singapore-Malaysia project, it's difficult to determine exactly what this reflects about the size of the team, but it certainly seems to be a relatively small one. Note the credit on game design, level design, and creative direction for Yandi Dono Pratobo. More on him in a second. Regrettably, the review scores of the game weren't enormously strong, and it makes you wonder if there's a degree of hunger within the studio itself that they would like to take on more original game projects than this smaller side project represents. After all, what's notable here is that in Nintendo's announcement, the business activities section of the document lists game development, including creation of in-game art assets, as what Nintendo are buying into. Now, it's completely possible that Nintendo are tasking Bandai Namco Singapore, or now Nintendo Singapore, with a new game, but the subsidiary does seem to have been rather cursed. On their website is still an interview with Yandi Dono Pratobo, who was excited to be returning to the studio, but since we know that several Bandai Namco projects were apparently shelved last year, it raises questions about whether this project he's talking about was Hiragami, or, given that this was touted as a side project, whether in fact there was a more significant sounding project that never came to fruition. If it's true that this group worked on a Star Wars game that got shelved, a Metroid Prime 4 game that got canned, and now something else that never saw the light of day, you can understand why morale may be fairly low at Bandai Namco Singapore, a studio which after all was only established in 2013, and so in many respects has more of a record of failures than it seems to have of great successes. The thing is, for Nintendo, having a graphical assist studio is going to be a more important thing than ever as they expand on 4K technology, and given the strength of their core development operations, I'm sure they have more than enough core developers at the heart of Nintendo if they wish. It doesn't necessarily seem likely to me that they will want, in short order, to rush games to market that are exclusively developed by Nintendo Studios Singapore. On the other hand, most students of Nintendo's relationships with their international subsidiaries will remember that Retro Studios had a lot of projects that were fascinating but going nowhere before Nintendo came and slapped Metroid Prime on the table. Nintendo are experts at understanding core gameplay and refining mechanics to perfection to ensure that they are fun, and so you can see that a hungry, creatively minded studio with incredibly strong artistic skills and good connections to a friendly local support studio in Bandai Namco Malaysia would be a very attractive get for Nintendo, not just as a bank of talent for their graphical teams, but potentially as future developers in their own right. Now, reportedly, it didn't work out with Metroid Prime, but Nintendo have high standards and seem very happy to axe underperforming projects, even from their very core teams. I've seen plausible sounding speculation that there was at least one Pikmin 4 build that got scrapped, as well as at least one recent, quite late in development, Retro Studios project. If it's true that Metroid Prime 4 was ever in the Singapore team's hands, it's an incredible show of confidence in the first place, given that even in the mid-2010s, Nintendo usually commissioned even well-respected teams like Grezzo and Mercury Steam to do remakes, remasters or ports before considering putting them on original endeavors. With Singapore integrated into the Nintendo Studio system, Nintendo can now have them walk before they run, and I suspect support work will be the immediate priority, followed by potentially a remake and only then an original title. Knowing Nintendo as well, they may have a specific franchise in mind, just as Grezzo have dedicated teams for their major series. Now, if this is the case, there is one franchise that stands out to me as having huge potential utility here. If their lead game designer Yandy is still there, and obviously he was still there pretty recently as of Hiragami, he has a history particularly of sci-fi shooters and aerial combat, which has to make you wonder whether Singapore could be the location of a Star Fox revival. With Miyamoto seeming to be more globe-trotting these days, I could see him paying more attention to a new studio, just as he seems to still have received a direct credit on Tears of the Kingdom, F-099, and Pikmin 4, despite having left day-to-day game development, suggesting that he still is taking an interest in the wider Nintendo IP, with F-Zero and Pikmin particularly being ones that Nintendo must have a desire to continue to develop. Of course, their traditional game approach would be to have them remake a past title, perhaps Star Fox Assault or Star Fox Adventures, before branching out into their own game. And incidentally, who developed Star Fox Assault? Why, Bandai Namco. Obviously, this is nearly a decade before the Singapore team were formed, and there's no crossover of personnel as far as I can see. In fact, most of the senior people seem to be no longer even working at Bandai Namco, though Tsuyoshi Kobate continues to have management credits on Nintendo-facing projects like ARMS, and planner Koichi Inakuchi was also a planner on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Given the age of this game and the fact that nearly all the senior figures, even at Nintendo, seem to have moved on from regular video game development, it's always been a tough one to see a future for, but if the Singapore team do retain a close tie with Bandai Namco's grouping, it feels like there might be a potential to bring over people from Bandai Studio One to advise and bulk up the team. If Nintendo wanted the Singapore team to work on a Star Fox title, you can see why Bandai Namco, given its recent troubles, and the studio itself, might be a little reticent given the series' historically poor sales. Nintendo can absorb a weak performer far more easily, and they can take the long-term view that, as part of their IP strategy, each game can be part of a bigger picture. But you can understand why this might not have been the most appealing financial proposition to a subcontracting studio if their remuneration is in any even small way linked to sales. It's not like working on Super Smash Bros., which reliably will get massive sales even on the smaller systems. However, buying the studio offers the team guaranteed remuneration, as Nintendo pays its developers very well, providing job security and creative freedom so that they can keep developing until the title meets its potential, while not being a major running cost for Bandai Namco because of the expense of operating out of Singapore. Anyway, this all feels like a long shot, but given that Star Fox has to be a priority for Nintendo, it still does feel like a logical fit. On the other hand, they don't have to start out with a remount of Assault or even an original Switch 2 title. If the studio is really more strong in depth on graphics than it is on building game mechanics that can, for whatever reason, withstand cancellation or weak reviews, perhaps they might be better deployed not on a Switch 2 project first off, but something of a theme park ride with a Star Fox flavour. Climbing into a physical prototype of the R-Wing for a bespoke experience seems like, in many respects, a quite natural evolution of Star Fox at this point, and we've seen franchises grow out of theme parks before, Pirates of the Caribbean notably, so while it's a lateral step for Star Fox, it's not one that would necessarily be deadly for it. On a separate note, I find the name of the studio rather curious as well. Long ago I mentioned a possibility which I don't necessarily want to see, but which I do find plausible, which is that over time we might see the many branches of Nintendo homogenized into a more generic set of names. Instead of Retro Studios and Next Level Games, we might simply see Nintendo Studios Austin, Nintendo Studios Vancouver, and so on. Certainly, the new logos follow the trend of recent logos of being incredibly simple, with the red outline and the plain text, and of course, Nintendo doesn't really want its developers achieving celebrity or to receive specific attention outside of the monolithic body of Nintendo. They want to encourage the idea that these games are a corporate effort with only minimal behind-the-scenes information being released as is useful to them for their promotional strategies. One final thought, and that is that yet again we see Nintendo leveraging an existing relationship as opposed to going for completely new partners. Sure, with Shiver, it was a relationship with John Shepard that we hadn't really considered too much, but it did exist, and if Bandai Namco Singapore did indeed work on Metroid Prime 4 version 1, then this does suggest a long and deep relationship and has to make you question what other studios that Nintendo have a long relationship with might in future become part of the company, something I have delved into in another video that I will link at the end of this. Now on this channel I like to try to anticipate what's ahead by putting specific forecasts down in percentage terms so that they can be assessed for accuracy later. At this point therefore, I think there's a 70% chance we will see a Nintendo Studios Singapore credited by the end of 2027 on a new game, partly because I suspect that they are already well into development on supporting titles, and whether Splatoon, Animal Crossing, Smash, or a different franchise entirely, in any event, I'm sure a great art team will be a tremendous asset to many games as Nintendo seek to bring their big titles to market all the quicker. In terms of a completely new game from them, I suspect such a thing could be a long time coming though. Unless there's something already cooking, 3 or 4 years seems likely unless of course they do focus on a remake first. I think there's a 30% chance of a first-party game where the chief Nintendo studio is Nintendo Studios Singapore, including potentially a remake or remaster by the end of 2028. I've left that wording open enough to include a potential collaboration with Bandai Namco. And while there are lots of different possibilities for what they could be working on, I'll say there feels to be a 10% chance that we will see them on some kind of Star Fox project by the end of 2028, which seems low, but perhaps not when you consider the lack of any Star Fox news and the question over whether they'll have a project up and running in this timeframe. I think in a longer timescale, there's a decent chance we could see some overlap. On the other hand, I do think there's a 30% chance that we will see by the end of 2029, the team credited on a Splatoon title, given that they have already worked on Splatoon 3, and given the huge priority that Nintendo puts in making Splatoon a major franchise for them. In many respects, if they're not working on Star Fox, having them be a regular Splatoon assistance team developing the peripheral games might be a huge advantage to Nintendo and a very good reason to purchase the studio. Do check out this video on screen. Thanks as ever for watching, thanks to the channel's Patreon supporters, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.